I always believed that the dead should be allowed to rest in peace, but as I stood in the shadow of the church I built with my own 2 hands, I realized that for some people, even a grave is just real estate waiting to be developed. The morning air smelled of wet earth and the sharp, resinous scent of old pine needles, a fragrance that had comforted me for 40 years. I stood in the small cemetery behind the Chapel of Grace, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, mossy ground. This was my sanctuary. This was where I came to talk to God, and more often these days, to talk to Martha. Her headstone was right there, nestled under the sprawling branches of the old oak tree that had stood sentinel over this land long before I laid the first brick. The granite was cool to the touch, engraved with her name and the verse she loved, "Be still and know." But there was no stillness today. The silence was shattered by a sound that made my teeth ache, the aggressive metallic thwacking of a sledgehammer hitting wood. I frowned, my hand instinctively going to the small wooden cross I wore around my neck. I walked around the side of the church, my 78-year-old knees protesting the uneven ground. What I saw made my blood run cold. 3 men in neon orange vests were trampling through the flower beds, the azaleas Martha had planted with her own hands 3 weeks before she died. They were driving bright orange survey stakes into the soil, measuring lines that cut right through the church's foundation. One of them, a burly man with a clipboard, was pointing at the oak tree, Martha's tree, and making a slashing motion across his throat. I shouted, my voice rusty but loud. "What do you think you're doing?" The men didn't even look up. The one with the sledgehammer drove another stake into the heart of a blooming rhododendron. I yelled, moving faster than I should have, stumbling slightly over a root. "Get out of the flower beds!" The foreman turned slowly, looking me up and down with eyes that held zero respect for age or sanctity. He chewed on a toothpick, his face bored. "Not anymore, Pop," he said, tapping his clipboard. "We got the permits this morning. This is the future site of heritage luxury condos." I stammered, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "That's impossible. I donated this land. It belongs to the parish." "Take it up with the owner," the foreman shrugged, turning back to his crew.
Before I could process the absurdity of his words, the crunch of tires on gravel drew my attention to the driveway. A black Range Rover, sleek and menacing like a shark on wheels, pulled up right next to the church steps. The engine cut, and the door opened. My son, Mark, stepped out. He was 45 years old, but in that moment he looked like a stranger wearing my son's face. He was dressed in a suit that I knew cost more than the church's entire annual operating budget, charcoal gray, tailored to hide the softness of a life lived in air conditioning. He wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and he checked his watch before he even looked at me. Mark hadn't visited this church in 5 years. He hadn't visited his mother's grave since the funeral. "What?" I asked, confusion warring with a sudden, sinking dread in my gut. "What is going on?" He walked over to me, his Italian leather shoes crunching on the path. He didn't hug me. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like restraint. He looked past me, at the church, at the land. He didn't see the history. He didn't see the prayers soaked into the wood. He looked at it like a butcher looks at a carcass, calculating the yield. "Dad, don't make a scene," Mark said, his voice smooth, practiced, the voice he used to close deals. "I told the foreman to be quick, but I knew you'd be out here. Look, the congregation is dwindling, you know that. Attendance is down 50%. The roof needs repairs." "It's a church, Mark." "Everything is a business, Dad," he sighed, taking off his sunglasses to reveal eyes that were dead to history, alive only to profit. "I spoke with the new pastor. He agreed. It's time to modernize. We're moving the church to a storefront downtown. Better parking, air conditioning, lower overhead." "You can't move a sanctuary, and you certainly can't sell the land. I donated these 10 acres in 1985. "And God needs liquidity," Mark said, a smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "This land is zoned for high-density residential now. I pulled some strings with the zoning board.
It's worth $4 million, Dad. 4. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. I looked at the survey stake driven into the ground, inches from the foundation I had poured myself. You can't sell this, I said, my voice trembling with a rage I hadn't felt in decades. Your mother is buried here, right there under the oak tree.
Mark winced, just slightly, but he covered it with a sigh of exasperation, treating me like a toddler throwing a tantrum in a supermarket. We'll move her, he said casually. There's a nice cemetery across town, very well maintained. I choked out. She wanted to rest here. She's dead, Dad. Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. And as for the donation, I had my legal team look at the deed you signed back in '85. It was a standard quitclaim, simple transfer of ownership. You didn't include a perpetuity clause. He unfolded the paper, showing me a photocopy of my own signature from 40 years ago. The church board voted to sell last night, Mark continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And guess who the buyer is? My shell company. I'm buying it for $2 million, selling the condo units for 20. I'm keeping it in the family, Dad. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just a sale, it was a heist. He hadn't just bought the land, he had orchestrated the sale from the inside, manipulating a weak pastor and a desperate board to acquire his own father's donation for pennies on the dollar. He was stealing the church I built to enrich himself. You're a thief, I said, stepping back from his hand. I'm developing assets, Mark corrected, checking his watch again. Look, I know this is emotional for you. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a glossy brochure. He pressed it into my hand. The cover showed smiling elderly people playing bridge in a sterile beige room. Sunrise Senior Living Community. I reserved a spot for you, Dad, Mark said, smiling like he had just given me a gift. It's in the next county. Great facilities. Heated pool. No more yard work. It's better this way. I looked at the brochure. I looked at the orange stake. I looked at my son. I spent 40 years praying for this boy's soul, asking God to guide him, to give him wisdom. But I realize now, standing in the wreckage of my trust, that I should have been praying for protection from his greed. They say the devil wears Prada, but in my life, he wears my last name and drives a Range Rover. I looked at the brochure again, feeling the glossy paper under my calloused thumb. If you are watching this, listen to me closely. Never assume your legacy is safe just because you gave it to God. Never assume that the people you raised will respect what you built. Check the paperwork. Check the fine print.
And never, ever trust a man who sees a graveyard as a building site, even if you changed his diapers. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had something sacred stolen by someone you loved, because right now, I feel like the loneliest man on earth. I'm not going to a home, I said, dropping the brochure into the dirt. You don't have a choice, Mark said, his voice hardening. The sale closes tomorrow. Demolition starts Monday. The eviction notice for the parsonage is in the mail. Say your goodbyes, Dad. He turned on his heel, dusting imaginary pollen off his expensive suit. He walked back to his car, got in, and drove away without looking back. I stood there for a long time. The workmen finished driving their stakes and left. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the trampled azaleas. I walked over to Martha's grave. I sat down on the grass, not caring about the dampness seeping into my trousers. I touched the cold stone. I'm sorry, Martha, I whispered. I sat there until the stars came out, feeling the weight of my defeat. I was an old man against a developer with millions of dollars and a team of lawyers. I was done. But then, a memory flickered in the darkness. He said there were no restrictions. He said I used a standard lawyer. But I didn't use a standard lawyer in 1985. I closed my eyes, thinking back 40 years. I remembered the smell of pipe tobacco and old law books. I remembered sitting in the office of Judge Silas Vance. Silas was a hard man, a man who hated developers, a man who believed that land was more than just dirt. I remembered a specific conversation. I remembered Silas leaning over his mahogany desk, his bushy eyebrows drawn together. Samuel, he had said, you're giving this land to the church, and that's noble. But churches change. People change. We need to protect this. I remembered him drafting something, a handwritten addendum. He didn't trust typewriters. He wrote it out in his spidery, copperplate script and stapled it to the back of the deed before we filed it. Reversionary rights, Silas had called it. Mark relied on the digital transfer from 2000 when the county digitized its records. He probably only looked at the scanned front page. He didn't check the physical archives. He didn't check the original book. I stood up.
My knees popped loudly in the quiet night, but the pain felt distant. A cold, hard resolve settled in my chest, replacing the grief. Mark thought he had found a loophole.
He thought he was smarter than his old man, but he forgot that I built things to last. I wasn't going to the senior living community. I wasn't going to let them dig up my wife. I dusted off my pants. I looked at the church one last time. "Hold on, Martha," I said to the darkness. The smell of old paper is the smell of justice waiting to be exhumed. And as I walked into the basement of the County Hall of Records, I prayed that the dust hadn't settled too deeply on the truth. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly green glow over rows of metal shelves packed floor to ceiling with heavy leather-bound ledgers. This was the place where history was kept, not the digital cloud where Mark lived, but the physical reality of ink on paper. A young clerk, barely out of college, sat behind a desk, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I approached, her expression of a mix of boredom and mild annoyance at being interrupted. "What can I help you with?" she asked, not bothering to hide the gum she was chewing. "I need to see the deed book from 1985, I said, leaning my cane against the counter. She sighed, tapping a few keys on her computer. "Sir, all records post-1980 have been digitized. You can access them on the terminals upstairs." "I don't want the digital copy," I insisted, my voice firm. "I want the physical book." "We don't usually pull the originals unless there's a discrepancy," she said, eyeing my worn clothes. "There is a discrepancy," I said, "a $4 million discrepancy." She rolled her eyes but stood up, disappearing into the labyrinth of shelves. I waited, listening to the hum of the dehumidifiers. I knew Mark hadn't been down here. He was a man of the future, a man who believed that if it wasn't on a screen, it didn't exist. He trusted the digital transfer from 2000, the lazy data entry of a temp worker who probably skipped the stapled addendum because it was handwritten. The clerk returned, heaving a massive, dust-covered book onto the counter. It landed with a heavy thud that shook the desk. "Volume 402, she said, brushing dust off her hands. I opened the book. The pages were yellowed, smelling of vinegar and thyme. I turned them carefully, my calloused fingers trembling slightly. Page 50, page 75, page 88. There it was, the quitclaim deed transferring 10 acres from Samuel P. Miller to the Chapel of Grace Parish. I scanned the typed text. It was standard boilerplate legality. Mark was right about the front page. It looked clean. But then I turned the page. Stapled to the back, written in Judge Silas Vance's unmistakable spidery script, was a single sheet of legal pad paper. It had yellowed with age, but the ink was black and permanent. Addendum A, reversionary rights and possibility of reverter. I read the words, and I felt the weight of 40 years lift off my shoulders. If this land is ever used for any purpose other than a place of worship, or if the structures thereon are demolished for commercial gain, ownership of said land shall automatically revert to the donor, Samuel P. It was there, the safety net Silas had woven. But then I read the next paragraph, a clause I had forgotten about, a clause Silas must have added, knowing the nature of greed better than I did. Condition of moral standing. If the donor's heir attempts to profit from the sale or commercial development of this consecrated ground, said heir forfeits all rights to the property. Silas had known. Even back then, he had seen something in a 5-year-old Mark, or perhaps he just knew the corrupting nature of inheritance. He had built a trap door into the deed. Mark couldn't sell it, and because he tried to sell it, he couldn't even inherit it. I closed the book. I didn't smile. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. I was about to destroy my son to save my wife's grave. I pulled out my phone, a simple flip phone I kept for emergencies, and dialed a number. "It's Samuel. I found it," I said when she answered. "It's Samuel. I found it." Evelyn was my neighbor, a retired contract lawyer who spent her days gardening and terrifying the local HOA board. She met me on the courthouse steps an hour later. She read the certified copy I had paid $5 for. She read it twice. Then she laughed, a dry, terrifying sound like dead leaves scraping concrete. "He didn't do a title search on the physical archives," she said, shaking her head. "He relied on the abstract. Samuel, this is ironclad.
This is a fee-simple determinable estate. The moment he filed that permit for the condos, the moment he signed the intent to sell, he triggered the clause. The land doesn't belong to him. It doesn't even belong to the church anymore. Can I sue him? I asked. Against a digital record? Absolutely. She looked at me, her eyes sharp. He sold something he doesn't own to foreign investors. That's fraud, Samuel. I know, I said. Monday morning arrived with the pomp and circumstance of a coronation. Mark had spared no expense.
A massive white tent had been erected on the lawn next to the church, dangerously close to the cemetery. There were caterers serving champagne. There was a podium draped in velvet. A banner strung between two trees read, "Heritage Luxury Condos. The future is here." The parking lot was full of luxury cars. I saw the mayor shaking hands. I saw men in expensive suits speaking languages I didn't recognize, the investors Mark had bragged about. And in the center of it all was Mark, holding a golden shovel, his smile bright and predatory for the local news cameras. I parked my old truck on the shoulder of the road. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was wearing my work boots, my denim gardening overalls, and a flannel shirt. I grabbed the pitchfork from the truck bed, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. I grabbed the thick legal envelope Evelyn had prepared. Evelyn got out of her car and stood beside me. She adjusted her glasses. "Let's get it over with," I said. We walked onto the property. The security guards saw us immediately. Two large men in black suits started walking toward us, their hands raised. "Sir, this is a private event," one of them said. He gestured to the pitchfork. I didn't stop walking. I looked him in the eye. "Get off my land," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of 40 years of ownership behind it. The guard hesitated. He saw something in my face that made him step back. Mark saw the commotion. His smile faltered. He excused himself from the investors and rushed to the edge of the tent. "Mark," he hissed, his face flushing red. "What are you doing? I told you to stay away. Security!" "I'm not leaving, Mark," I said, walking past the guards who were now too confused to stop me. I walked straight up the center aisle of the tent, my boots muddying the red carpet. Mark laughed nervously, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, my father. He's having a hard time letting go. It's sentimental. Dad, please." "I'm not the one who should be embarrassed," I said. I stepped onto the makeshift stage. Mark tried to grab my arm, but I shrugged him off. I snatched the microphone from the podium. The feedback squealed, a high-pitched shriek that silenced the crowd instantly. I looked out at the sea of faces. The mayor looked annoyed. The investors looked confused. "My son told you he bought this land," I said, my voice echoing over the speakers. "He told you the title was clear." I paused. I looked at Mark.
He was staring at me with a mixture of anger and fear. Mark lunged for the mic. "That's enough!" I shouted over him. I handed the certified copy of the 1985 deed to the mayor, who was standing in the front row. "Read the reverter clause, Mr. Mayor." The mayor, sensing a political disaster, took the paper. He adjusted his glasses. He read the handwritten addendum. His face went pale. He looked up at Mark, then back at the paper. "What?" the mayor asked, his voice quiet but amplified by the silence of the tent. Mark stammered, sweat breaking out on his forehead. "It wasn't in the digital system. It's not valid." Evelyn stepped up to the stage. She looked small next to Mark, but she radiated authority. "It is recorded in volume 402, page 88 of the county archives," she announced, her voice sharp as a razor. "And by filing for a commercial permit last week, Mark, you triggered the clause." She turned to the investors. "Gentlemen, the contracts you signed this morning are void." The tent erupted. The investors turned on Mark instantly. They started shouting in multiple languages, waving their contracts. One of them, a large man with a scar on his cheek, grabbed Mark by the lapels of his expensive suit. "We wired the down payment this morning," he shouted. Mark was hyperventilating. He looked at me, his eyes wide and terrified. "Dad, you can't do this. I leveraged everything. I used the firm's assets for the deposit. If this deal fails, I lose my house. I lose the firm." "You tried to dig up your mother," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "You tried to sell God's house for condos. You didn't lose your firm, Mark." Mark screamed, tears streaming down his face now. "You have to sign it over. Just sign a waiver." I looked at him. I saw the little boy I had taught to fish. I saw the teenager I had taught to drive. And I saw the man who had looked at his mother's grave and seen a parking lot. "I can't,"
I said. "It's out of my hands." The police arrived 10 minutes later, not for me, but because the investors were threatening violence. Mark was trying to explain, trying to spin it, but the fraud was too clear. He had sold land he didn't own. One of the investors' lawyers, a sharp woman in a blue suit, walked up to Mark and handed him a paper. "You are being served," she said. "We are suing for fraud, breach of contract, and damages."
I watched as Mark collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, his golden shovel lying in the dirt at his feet. His empire of steel and glass had crumbled under the weight of a single piece of paper. 2 hours later, the tent was gone. The investors had left in a convoy of angry black cars. Mark had driven away, defeated, to face a team of auditors. The silence returned to the churchyard. I stood by the oak tree. The survey stakes were gone. I had pulled them up myself. The azaleas were trampled, but they would grow back. Roots are resilient. I sat down on the grass next to Martha's headstone. I patted the earth. It was still warm from the afternoon sun. "He didn't get you, Martha," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "You're safe." I looked at the church. The Historical Society had already called. They were thrilled. They were going to designate it a protected landmark. It could never be sold. It could never be developed. I would be allowed to live in the parsonage as the caretaker for the rest of my life. I was poor. My son hated me. My family was broken. But the land was safe. I looked directly at the setting sun, feeling the peace settle over me. My son wanted to build a legacy of steel and glass. He wanted to reach the sky. Instead, he built a prison of debt and lawsuits. He forgot the most important rule of the harvest. You reap exactly what you sow. And sometimes when you sow greed,